In a galaxy ruled by strength and conquest, the Valkyries reigned supreme. Known for their unmatched combat skills and fierce warrior culture, they dominated entire star systems with an iron fist. To the Valkyries, other species were merely obstacles, humans included. Despite their technological advancements, humans were viewed as little more than primitives, unworthy of serious consideration. The Valkyries saw themselves as the pinnacle of evolution, and their disdain for those they deemed inferior was absolute. Far from the bustling centers of the galaxy, a human expeditionary force navigated the outer reaches of space. The mission was routine, exploration and resource gathering in uncharted territories. The crew, led by Lieutenant Alex Carter, was unaware of the lurking danger. They had heard rumors of the Valkyries, but none had ever encountered them. The galaxy was vast, and the odds of crossing paths with such a formidable enemy seemed slim. Yet, as they ventured deeper into the unknown, fate had other plans. Without warning, the human ship's sensors blared alarms. Before Carter and his team could react, they were ambushed. Valkyrie warships descended upon them with a speed and ferocity that left no room for defense. The battle was swift and brutal. The Valkyries, with their superior weaponry and tactics, overwhelmed the human forces with ease. What had been a routine mission turned into a desperate struggle for survival. The human ship, crippled and outgunned, stood no chance against the onslaught. In mere moments, the skirmish was over, and the crew was at the mercy of their captors. Captured and disarmed, Carter and his team were transported aboard the Valkyrie flagship. The towering figures of their captors loomed over them, their cold eyes filled with disdain. The humans were shackled, their every move monitored by the ever-watchful Valkyrie guards. The air was thick with tension, a palpable reminder of the power dynamics at play. The Valkyries took pride in their superiority, and their treatment of the prisoners reflected this belief. The humans were nothing more than spoils of war, trophies to be paraded before their conquerors. As Carter and his men were led through the ship, the full extent of the Valkyrie culture became apparent. The ship's halls were lined with trophies from countless battles, armor, weapons, and the remains of those who had dared to challenge the Valkyries. This was a race that lived and breathed warfare. Their entire existence revolved around the art of combat, and their society was built on the idea that only the strongest deserved to survive. To the Valkyries, weakness was not an option, it was a death sentence. The Valkyries were not just warriors, they were a people with a deep-seated belief in their own superiority. From birth, they were trained to be fighters, with every aspect of their lives revolving around the concept of strength. They viewed themselves as the rightful rulers of the galaxy, destined to conquer and subjugate all who stood in their way. Other species were seen as challenges to be overcome or obstacles to be crushed. The idea that humans, or any other species, could be their equals was laughable. Lieutenant Alex Carter was no stranger to adversity. He had faced his share of challenges in the line of duty, but nothing could have prepared him for the situation he now found himself in. Standing before his captors, he refused to let fear or despair take hold. Carter was a man of principle, a leader who inspired loyalty and respect among his team. He had risen through the ranks not just because of his skills, but because of his unwavering determination and sense of honor. These qualities had seen him through countless missions, and he would need them now more than ever. As the Valkyries evaluated their prisoners, it became clear that Carter was different. His calm demeanor and unyielding spirit set him apart from the others. Even in captivity, he carried himself with a quiet strength that did not go unnoticed. The Valkyries, who valued physical prowess above all else, were intrigued by the human who seemed unaffected by his dire circumstances. They could break his body, but they could see that breaking his spirit would be a far more difficult task. Carter's resolve was not born from arrogance or defiance, but from a deep-seated belief in the value of his people. He knew that to the Valkyries, he was little more than a curiosity, a lesser being who would be easily discarded. But he also knew that this was an opportunity to show them what humans were truly capable of. Carter's mind was already at work, formulating plans, seeking weaknesses, and analyzing the situation from every angle. He was a soldier, and soldiers did not surrender easily. As the hours passed, Carter's thoughts turned to his team. He knew they were counting on him to find a way out of this. The Valkyries may have been superior in strength and technology, but Carter had faith in the ingenuity and resilience of the human spirit. He would endure whatever trials the Valkyries threw at him, and he would do so with the determination that had defined his career. Carter was no stranger to impossible odds, and he was ready to meet this challenge head-on. The capture of Alex Carter marked the beginning of a journey that would change the course of the galaxy. What the Valkyries had intended as a simple display of dominance would become something far more significant. For in Carter, they had found not just a prisoner, but a man who would challenge their very beliefs. The stage was set, and the trials that lay ahead would determine not just the fate of Carter and his team, but the future of humanity's place in the galaxy. Carter's arrival at the Valkyrie Palace was nothing short of a spectacle. The towering structures, carved from stone and metal, loomed over him, exuding power and dominance. He was paraded through the grand halls, surrounded by Valkyrie warriors who looked at him with a mixture of amusement and contempt. To them, he was an oddity, a creature of lesser importance. The chains around his wrists, and the harsh grips of his captors reminded him of his new status. He was no longer a lieutenant. Here, he was a pet, a possession to be displayed and discarded at will. The Valkyrie princess awaited him in a vast chamber, her throne elevated to emphasize her status. As Carter was brought before her, she observed him with cold, calculating eyes. The room fell silent as the Valkyries presented their prize, a human, captured and tamed. The princess's expression remained unreadable, but there was a flicker of curiosity in her gaze. She had seen countless beings brought before her, but this human, with his defiant posture and unwavering gaze, was different. Yet, despite this curiosity, she treated him with the same disdain she showed all lesser beings. The initial treatment Carter received was demeaning, stripping away any remnants of dignity. He was forced to kneel, his head bowed, as the Valkyries discussed him as though he were an object. The princess's words were sharp and dismissive, emphasizing his inferiority. He was made to endure their ridicule, their jeers, all while maintaining his composure. The cultural shock of being viewed as a lesser being was profound, but Carter's resolve did not waver. He knew he was being tested, and he would not give them the satisfaction of seeing him broken. The trials began soon after his arrival. The first was designed to test his physical endurance, a brutal series of challenges meant to push him to his limits. Carter was thrown into a harsh environment, forced to navigate treacherous terrain under the watchful eyes of the Valkyries. The conditions were grueling, with searing heat and unrelenting obstacles meant to sap his strength. The Valkyries expected him to falter, to show the weakness they believed inherent in his species. But Carter, driven by sheer willpower, endured every trial thrown his way. Each step he took was a testament to his resilience. The pain in his muscles, the exhaustion in his body, none of it was enough to break him. He stumbled, fell, and rose again, determined not to give in. His captors watched in silence, their initial amusement turning to grudging respect. They had expected him to fail, but as he pushed through the trials with unyielding determination, they began to see him in a different light. The whispers among the Valkyries grew. Perhaps this human was more than just a pet. The first interactions between Carter and the princess were tense, a battle of wills beneath the surface. She would summon him, observing him from her throne as he stood before her, bruised and battered from the trials. Her disdain was evident in every word she spoke, but behind her cold exterior was a spark of curiosity she couldn't fully hide. Carter's spirit intrigued her, though she would never admit it. She expected him to cower, to show submission, but instead, he met her gaze with a defiance that both irritated and fascinated her. The princess, raised to believe in her own superiority, found herself challenged by this human who refused to break. His resolve forced her to confront the possibility that she might have underestimated him. Each encounter left her more intrigued, though she masked it with disdain. She would set new challenges for him, pushing him further, eager to find the point at which he would finally crumble. But Carter, driven by a determination to prove humanity's worth, met each challenge head-on, his spirit unbroken. In the quiet moments between trials, Carter had time to reflect. The weight of his situation pressed heavily upon him, but he refused to let it crush his spirit. He knew he was more than just a captive, he was the representative of his species, and his actions would shape the Valkyrie's perception of humanity. The thought gave him strength. His mind often wandered back to Earth, to the people he had left behind, and it fueled his determination to endure. He would not let them down. He would show the Valkyries that humans were not to be underestimated. Carter's reflections were not just about survival, but about strategy. He was in enemy territory, surrounded by those who saw him as little more than an animal. Yet, he sensed an opportunity. The Valkyries, for all their power, had a rigid code, one that he could exploit. If he could endure, if he could show them what he was made of, he could shift the balance. Each trial was not just a test of his physical limits, but of his mental fortitude. He would endure, he would survive, and in doing so, he would change the way they saw him, and by extension, humanity. As the trials continued, Carter's influence began to grow, subtly at first, but undeniably. The Valkyries who watched him began to speak of him with a grudging respect. The princess, though she continued to treat him with disdain, could no longer deny the strength he displayed. The seeds of doubt were planted, and Carter knew that with time, those seeds would grow. He was no longer just a pet in their eyes, he was something more, something they had not anticipated. The stage was set for what was to come. Carter's trials had only just begun, but already, he was leaving an indelible mark on those who witnessed his endurance. His presence in the Valkyrie Palace was a quiet storm, one that would soon reshape the very foundations of their beliefs. The next trial Carter faced was unlike the brutal tests of endurance he had endured before. This time, the challenge was designed to test his mind, to prove that humans were intellectually inferior to the Valkyries. The trial required him to navigate a complex series of puzzles, each one more difficult than the last, all while under the watchful eyes of his captors. The Valkyries expected him to fail, confident that his limited human intellect would falter. They had crafted these puzzles to confound, believing no human could solve them. Carter approached the trial with a calm determination. He knew the Valkyries were looking for any sign of weakness, but he had no intention of giving them what they wanted. As he examined the first puzzle, he quickly realized it was more than just a test of intelligence. It was a test of creativity, logic, and adaptability. These were qualities that had served him well in his military career, and he was determined to use them now. With each puzzle, Carter's mind worked methodically, analyzing the problems from different angles, seeking unconventional solutions. The Valkyries watched with growing surprise as Carter solved puzzle after puzzle. His approach was different from what they had expected, relying not just on brute logic but on an innate understanding of how systems could be manipulated and adapted. He used tools in ways they hadn't anticipated, reconfiguring the elements of the puzzles to achieve his goals. It wasn't long before murmurs of admiration began to ripple through the onlookers. Carter's ingenuity was undeniable, and for the first time, the Valkyries found themselves questioning their assumptions about human intelligence. As the trial continued, it became clear that Carter was not just surviving the challenges, he was excelling. The final puzzle, a complex mechanism that required both precision and innovation, was solved in a way that left even the most seasoned Valkyrie engineers impressed. Carter's success in the trial forced the Valkyries to reconsider their views. They had intended to humiliate him, to show him that he was inferior, but instead, they were confronted with evidence that he was anything but. The seeds of doubt, once small and insignificant, began to grow. The attitudes of the Valkyries towards Carter began to shift. Where there had once been only contempt, there was now a begrudging respect. The warriors who had watched him endure the trials and solve the puzzles could no longer dismiss him as a mere pet. He had shown a level of resilience and intelligence that demanded recognition. Slowly, the Valkyries around him began to treat him differently, no longer with disdain but with a cautious curiosity. Carter's presence was no longer seen as an insult. It was becoming a challenge to their deeply held beliefs. Among those who began to see Carter in a new light were a few Valkyries who would become key allies. They were warriors who valued strength and skill above all else, and they couldn't ignore the qualities Carter had displayed. These Valkyries started to engage with him, asking questions, testing his knowledge, and finding themselves increasingly impressed by his responses. They had never considered the possibility that a human could match them in anything, but Carter was proving them wrong, one interaction at a time. His influence began to spread quietly, changing minds and attitudes in ways that even he didn't fully realize. The princess, too, found herself increasingly drawn to Carter. At first, she had seen him as little more than an amusement, a curiosity to pass the time. But as she watched him navigate the trials, she couldn't help but feel a growing respect for his resilience and intellect. Their interactions, once marked by her cold superiority, began to shift. She no longer spoke to him with the same disdain. Instead, their conversations became more nuanced, filled with subtle exchanges that hinted at a deeper connection forming between them. There were moments when the princess found herself challenged by Carter's perspective, his unwavering belief in humanity's worth. It was something she had never encountered before, and it intrigued her. She began to see him not just as a pet or even an equal, but as someone who could understand her in ways her own people could not. The bond between them grew slowly, built on mutual respect and an unspoken recognition of each other's strengths. It was a connection that defied the strict hierarchies of Valkyrie society, and it left the princess questioning everything she had been taught. Carter's influence within the Valkyrie palace continued to expand. His actions, his attitude, and his refusal to be broken had a ripple effect on those around him. Valkyries who had once dismissed him as insignificant now found themselves reconsidering their views. The changes were small at first, an extra nod of acknowledgement, a brief exchange of respectful words, but they were significant in a society that valued strength above all else. Carter was showing them that strength came in many forms, and that humanity possessed a resilience they had not anticipated. As more Valkyries began to see Carter as something more than a pet, the foundations of their society were quietly being challenged. The idea that humans could be equals, or even allies, was one that had never been seriously considered. Yet Carter's presence and the growing respect he commanded were forcing a re-evaluation of these beliefs. It was a shift that did not go unnoticed by those who held power within the Valkyrie hierarchy. As Carter's influence spread, so too did the seeds of internal conflict. There were those who welcomed the change, but there were also those who saw it as a threat to the established order. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test the very fabric of Valkyrie society. Carter, through his actions and his unyielding spirit, had become a catalyst for change, whether he intended to or not. The shifting attitudes of the Valkyries were just the beginning, and the challenges that lay ahead would determine the future not just of Carter, but of the entire galaxy. The Valkyrie society, once united in its belief of superiority, began to fracture as the presence of Carter continued to challenge their long-held views. Among the Valkyries, a silent rift was growing. On one side were those who had come to respect Carter, seeing in him a strength that transcended their preconceived notions of human inferiority. These Valkyries, who valued courage and resilience, began to question the rigid hierarchies that defined their society. They saw in Carter not just a pet, but a potential ally, someone who could teach them new ways of thinking, of fighting, of leading. But not everyone welcomed this change. A faction of Valkyries, deeply rooted in the traditions of their ancestors, viewed Carter's influence as a corruption of their pure warrior culture. To them, he was a symbol of weakness, a dangerous threat to the values that had kept their society strong for centuries. They whispered among themselves, their disdain for the princess growing as they saw her becoming more lenient, more human in her judgments. This faction, led by a powerful and ambitious Valkyrie commander, believed that the only way to preserve their way of life was to remove the source of this corruption, both Carter and the princess who had allowed him to survive. As tensions mounted, Carter began to sense the unease in the palace. The air was thick with suspicion, and the once subtle glances of distrust had become more pronounced. His interactions with the princess grew increasingly fraught with unspoken concerns. He noticed the way the loyal Valkyries moved with a heightened sense of alertness, as if they were preparing for something inevitable. Carter's instincts, honed by years of military service, told him that a storm was brewing, one that could have catastrophic consequences for everyone involved. It was during a quiet moment of reflection that Carter uncovered the truth. Eavesdropping on a conversation between two Valkyrie guards, he learned of the plot to overthrow the princess. The plan was simple but deadly: strike swiftly, remove the princess from power, and eliminate Carter as a symbol of her weakness. The revelation sent a cold shock through Carter. He realized that the Valkyrie society was on the brink of civil war, and that he was at the center of it. His first instinct was to find a way to escape, to use the chaos to his advantage and return to his own people. But then he thought of the princess, of the bond they had formed, and the respect she had shown him despite the risks to her own standing. Carter knew he couldn't leave her to face this threat alone. His sense of honor, something that had been ingrained in him since his earliest days in the military, wouldn't allow it. He had seen enough of the Valkyries to know that their society was flawed, but also that it had the potential for change. The princess represented that potential, and abandoning her now would mean abandoning the chance for something greater, a future where humans and Valkyries could stand as equals. Carter made his decision with a heavy heart, fully aware of the risks. He would stay and fight, not just for his own survival, but for the princess and the possibility of a better future. The preparation for the confrontation was intense. Carter knew he couldn't face the Valkyries head-on in combat. Their strength and numbers were overwhelming. Instead, he relied on his ingenuity, using his knowledge of human tactics to outthink his enemies. He carefully observed the palace, noting the guard rotations, the weak points in their security, and the layout of the corridors. He reached out to the few Valkyries who had shown him kindness, those who had begun to question the old ways, and discreetly enlisted their help. They were hesitant, torn between loyalty to their commander and their growing respect for Carter, but ultimately, they agreed to aid him. Carter devised a plan that played to his strengths: deception, surprise, and strategy. He knew the coup plotters would strike soon, and he intended to be ready for them. Every detail was meticulously thought out, from the timing of the guards' shifts to the placement of obstacles that would slow the coup faction's advance. The plan was risky, and there was no guarantee it would work, but Carter was determined to give it everything he had. He knew that if he failed, it wouldn't just be his life that was lost, it would be the future of the Valkyrie society as well. As the night of the coup approached, the tension in the palace became palpable. The loyal Valkyries, those who had chosen to stand with Carter and the princess, prepared themselves for the battle ahead. They moved in silence, their faces set in grim determination. The princess, though outwardly calm, was acutely aware of the danger she faced. She had come to trust Carter in ways she had never imagined possible, and his presence gave her strength. But she also knew that this battle would determine the fate of her rule, and possibly her life. Carter positioned himself strategically, ready to spring his trap the moment the coup plotters made their move. His mind raced with possibilities, constantly adjusting the plan as new information came to light. He was fully aware of the stakes, and the weight of his decisions pressed heavily on him. But there was no turning back now. The confrontation would decide everything, and Carter was ready to face whatever came next with the same unyielding resolve that had brought him this far. The stage was set, and all that remained was to see who would emerge victorious when the dust settled. The night of the coup arrived, shrouded in a tense silence that hung over the palace like a storm about to break. Carter, alongside the princess and her loyal Valkyries, stood ready. The air was thick with anticipation, every sound amplified in the stillness. When the first signs of the attack came, a distant clatter of armor, the quickened footsteps of the coup faction, Carter's plan was set into motion. The corridors of the palace, usually grand and imposing, became a battlefield of strategy and survival. The coup faction, confident in their strength and numbers, charged forward, only to find themselves ensnared by the traps Carter had laid. Walls that had once stood as symbols of power now became their hindrance, forcing the attackers into narrow choke points where their advantage was nullified. The Loyalists, though fewer in number, fought with precision, using every tactic Carter had taught them. His influence was clear in every move they made, their attacks calculated and efficient, turning the tide against their enemies. Amid the chaos, Carter was everywhere, coordinating defenses, reinforcing weak points, and rallying the Valkyries around him. His strategic mind, honed through years of military service, guided them through the battle with a calm authority that inspired confidence. The princess, fighting alongside her warriors, was a force to be reckoned with, her presence a beacon of strength that bolstered their resolve. The battle was fierce, the clang of weapons and the cries of warriors filling the halls, but under Carter's leadership, the Loyalists held their ground. As the fight reached its peak, a moment of crisis emerged. The coup leader, a formidable Valkyrie commander, pushed through the Loyalist defenses, her eyes set on the princess. In that instant, Carter saw the danger and knew what had to be done. Without hesitation, he threw himself into the path of the attack, taking the full force of the blow meant for the princess. The impact was brutal, the pain immediate and overwhelming, but Carter's mind was focused only on protecting her. His sacrifice turned the tide of the battle, galvanizing the Loyalists into a final, determined push that overwhelmed the coup faction. The princess, witnessing Carter's selfless act, felt a surge of emotion unlike anything she had ever known. The human she had once regarded as a mere pet had become something far more, a symbol of honor, courage, and the potential for a future beyond the rigid confines of Valkyrie tradition. As the battle raged around them, she fought with renewed vigor, leading her warriors with a fierce determination to honor Carter's sacrifice. The coup leader, sensing her defeat, fought desperately, but the resolve of the Loyalists was unbreakable. When the dust finally settled, it was the Loyalists who stood victorious. The coup faction, defeated and broken, lay scattered across the palace floor, their rebellion crushed. The loyal Valkyries, though battered and weary, raised their weapons in a silent salute to their fallen leader, acknowledging the sacrifice that had secured their victory. The princess knelt beside Carter, her hands trembling as she cradled him, her eyes reflecting a profound sorrow. She had won the battle, but it had come at a great cost. In the aftermath of the conflict, the Valkyrie society began to undergo a transformation. The story of Carter's bravery spread quickly, reaching every corner of their empire. Valkyries who had once viewed humans with contempt now spoke of Carter with reverence, his actions a testament to the strength of the human spirit. The princess, now secure in her rule, made it clear that the old ways of thinking would no longer be tolerated. The Valkyries, inspired by Carter's example, began to reassess their beliefs, opening themselves to the possibility of alliances with other species, including humans. Carter's legacy became a defining moment in Valkyrie history. His name was spoken with respect, his actions immortalized in the annals of their culture. The princess, forever changed by the events of that fateful night, led her people with a renewed sense of purpose. She forged new bonds with humanity, ensuring that Carter's sacrifice would not be in vain. The walls that had once separated their two species began to crumble, replaced by bridges of understanding and mutual respect. As the Valkyries and humans began to work together, the galaxy saw the dawn of a new era, one where cooperation and unity replaced the old divisions of power and conquest. Carter's influence had reached far beyond what anyone could have imagined, leaving an indelible mark on both societies. His actions had shown that strength was not just in physical prowess, but in the willingness to sacrifice for a greater good, to stand for what was right even in the face of overwhelming odds. In the end, Carter's legacy was one of hope, a hope that humans and Valkyries could coexist as equals, that they could build a future together where both species thrived. The princess, now a leader of a united people, often reflected on the man who had changed everything. She knew that the path ahead would not be easy, but with Carter's example to guide them, she was confident that they would succeed. And so, in the quiet moments of her rule, she would think of him, not just as the human who had once been her pet, but as the one who had become her equal, her protector, and her friend.